thanks very much for, I guess, the opportunity to tell you about the project. Obviously, acknowledge the funders for the research in terms of HEFCU, Welsh Government, and obviously in terms of the Low Carbon Energy and Environment, NRN. So this project involves researchers at three universities in Wales, so Aberystwyth, myself and colleagues Paul Robson and Maurice Bosch, at Bangor University, Graham Ormeroyd, Morwenna Spear and Simon Curling, and at Cardiff at the Welsh School of Architecture at the university, Phil Jones. So Phil, Graham and Morwenna are also here in the audience today as well. So in terms of what we do here in the Plants and Architecture project is very much at that interface between the disciplines. So in terms of myself as a plant scientist, in the case of Graham and colleagues of material science, and in the case of Phil of architecture, of actually using the knowledge that we have our own disciplines to actually be tackling some of what we believe are the big challenges of in effect of this century. And really, so this learning is very much looking at architecture learning from plants. So here the idea being around nature-inspired design and what gets referred to as biomimicry. So this is a philosophy in effect of architecture in terms of approaches of tackling problems, improving efficiency, improving sustainability and reducing the carbon imprint of the built environment. And in the case of plant science, we're looking at learning from architecture and particularly the design principles for how we can look at improving crops. And then from those learning from each other, we also then want to bring those skills together. So the plant science, the material science, the architecture, and look at the natural and the built environments together. So how are we going to use living plants, but also plant-derived products in the built environment? And then particularly thinking about what that means for the future in the form of future cities and in areas such as vertical farming and urban gardening. So it's probably worth, in terms of just thinking about the background to this, I think often we don't think enough about just actually what the changes we've undergone and actually are continuing to undergo. And if we think about the urbanisation, this enormous move there's been and continues to be from the rural to the urban environment and culture. The degree of modernisation is progressive transition to a modern society. And of course these sort of things are happening at different paces in different parts of the world, different towns, cities in even the same country. Industrialisation, so this sort of period of dramatic social and economic change, and this again enormous transformation from agricultural to industrial based societies. And then clearly the rationalisation processes, so the replacement of a lot of the traditions, the values and emotions that exist in rural agricultural based societies, and what that means when people then move to cities. And of course, very pertinent to this particular NRN around climate and those dramatic increases that even in our own lifetimes have happened in terms of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and what that's meaning as we're hearing Patricia's talk about extremes of climate. And another way of looking at this, and particularly again very relevant to this NRN cluster, is this dramatic change that's happened in terms of urban growth in recent human history. So if we only go back I guess just over 50 years ago to 1960, basically a third of the total global population lived in towns and cities. Again, this is going to be very different. In the case of the UK, we industrialised, modernised very much earlier on than many other countries, so we were already at higher than that in 1960 and obviously continue to be. So, but in 2008, it was a very dramatic point in human history, and that was when 50% of the world's population were now living in towns and cities. So already since then, 7 years later, we're up to 55%. But incredibly dramatically, 2050, 70 to 80% of the total global population are predicted to be living in towns and cities. And of course, that is it's even more dramatic than that. So if you think about 1960, the world's population was 3 billion. 2050, it's predicted to be at least 9 billion. So this is 1 billion people were living in towns and cities back in 1960. By 2050, we're looking at 6 billion. So we're going from 1 billion to 6 billion people living in towns and cities within less than a century. So in a sense, that's really very much the backdrop to thinking about this NRN. So, of course, living in cities is not all bad. In fact, there's huge benefits, which is why in fact that shift has happened. Clearly, living in cities brings big benefits in terms of offering more favourable setting for resolution of social environmental problems that we've been hearing about, the way that it can be used to generate jobs and income, delivers a number of the services that we need in terms of education, healthcare, and so on, because you've got the opportunities of scale and proximities. You've got enormous changes that happen in terms of social mobilisation and empowerment associated with those as well. And of course, the density of urban life, particularly with that increasing population, means that we can relieve the pressure on natural habitats, and also importantly on the huge pressures that's happening around biodiversity, which is as dramatic as the changes that we're seeing in climate change. So the challenge really is about trying to exploit the possibilities really that urbanisation offers, and obviously ameliorate the negative aspects. And it's probably worth also considering that many of the issues and the challenges that exist in the urban environment also exist in the rural environment, but they're often in different directions. So in one direction in the city, often the concerns are about overburdening services, and in the case of rural, it's about losing the critical mass and having those services lost. So there's lots of thinking that's been done in relation to things like One Planet Living, about how are we going to deal with these challenges, how are we going to cope with larger number of people and the various commodities that they consume, and particularly aspects such as food and energy and water. And so, what does that mean in terms of the way that we can use the resources we have, minimise waste, reuse waste? How do we solve the issues of transport, mass transport, the materials that we make and use, the food, the water? How do we maintain lifestyle, heritage, and basically all the services that we need to exist? And clearly, as part of the way that cities and towns have operated and the way that civilization has developed, it has been along the lines of the utilisation clearly of crops initially and livestock in terms of agriculture, but in terms of the way that we've actually lived and used plants has been very important in terms of the buildings that we've lived in. So plants that provide renewable raw materials for us in buildings. So in terms of construction, timber frames, wattle and thatch, and obviously entire buildings. Revisiting many of those now, of course, and recent talks about straw bale houses and so on as well. Of course, there's been a big sort of design inspiration, probably very much typified under the sort of Art Nouveau period at the beginning of the last century. And of course, importantly, plants have been used in cities to improve air quality, human health, and general well-being in terms of the use of parks and, importantly, I guess, avenues of trees to remove particulates. And again, big sort of interest again in how we do that. So really, in terms of the project, the sort of areas that we're looking at, as I say, is the areas of things like biomimicry, so the built environment, learning from natural environment, thinking about microclimates and how do we use plants to in the form of greening in cities, potentially green roofs and walls, to reduce urban heat island effects and also reduce air pollution. The growing of plants on buildings as both living plants, but also their products as well to reduce the energy use of buildings, how we might manage water and again improve the air quality, and also importantly psychological benefits. So there's been quite a number of studies now looking at the benefits, particularly in terms of people that have green vistas outside hospital windows and the speed and the improved speed of recovery from that. And importantly, the use of sustainable materials within buildings, so the use of plants as a sustainable, renewable source of building materials, which actually have improved performance on those buildings, both of human health and in terms of carbon. And then taking that information, thinking about what that means for future cities and the way that we can make those smarter, more efficient by integrating the disciplines that we all come from, and using examples such as vertical farming about how we can actually achieve that in terms of bringing these things together as an example, and certainly as a sort of thought process about how we might achieve that. So just some examples. These two here are actually recent buildings that were built with both Welsh Government and in fact BBSRC funding at Aberystwyth, where we've got green roofs and walls. Other buildings that are being built in other parts of the world, which again having a lot more recent buildings featuring those. We're also now seeing more buildings that are actually featuring roof gardens, again, the sort of psychological benefit for people, but also in terms of production of food within those environments as well. And in recent years, we've been hearing about examples such as the Zero Carbon Food Company, now using some of the Second World War air raid shelters in London, and using these for the production of salad and also herbs that are going to restaurants and stores. So, from the architectural perspective, we then move also then into the sort of plant science bit in terms of what we can learn. And this is an image of what you'll have seen in the chief scientist's video, was this the national capability of plant phenomics at Aberystwyth. And this is in effect a robotised glass house, where we'll be using this as part of the project, where we can look at and understand plant growth and form, and in particular we're going to be looking at canopy. But this kind of technology is some of the kind of technology that's also been looked at and used in some of the thinking and development of vertical farming at the moment. So if we think about crop canopies, and really if we want to increase biomass production, biomass for human food, for feed, for giving for animals, or for biomass for energy, we really want to maximise, in effect, photosynthesis in terms of fixation of carbon and production of biomass from that. And the main ways really to achieve that are about increasing the duration of the canopy of the crop. So if we have a short duration, if we only have a canopy that exists for three of the 12 months of the year, then we're clearly not going to fix as much carbon as if we have a canopy for 6 or potentially 9 months. We're talking about temperate regions. So we need to extend that duration. Clearly, once we start extending that duration earlier or later in the year, we're running against the risk of frosts and the potentially that we'll have lethal temperatures. The other aspects are not only about increasing the duration of the canopy, but also then about the efficiency of that canopy at intersecting light, and also potentially the anatomy and the biochemistry of the crops within that. Now, in terms of the anatomy and the biochemistry, probably the most dramatic thing that you can do is the differences between the C3, which is the normal form of photosynthesis, and C4 photosynthesis, which is a form of photosynthesis that's evolved in a number of tropical grasses in particular. Interesting thing, that's happened probably independently 70 plus times. That features in a number of, in fact, crops that are used for biomass production because of that increased efficiency, and many funders in recent years, like Gates Foundation, have been looking at how that kind of increased photosynthetic efficiency can be put into crops such as rice. But whichever kind of crop we're looking at, if we can increase the duration, if we can improve the efficiency of the canopy in the way that will accept light, then we'll increase overall productivity. And of course, that is going to underpin sustainable intensification. How do we get more from less? And this is just an example of, this actually is a commercial variety of miscanthus, and this is another, in effect, a new variety. And you can see, if you just point the camera upwards, this canopy is intercepting far more light than that one. And in effect, so how do plants intercept more light? It's about the architecture of the crop, and therefore the kind of canopy it forms. And this is just a set of cartoons of how we may have very erect stems, or we may have very prostrate stems, and likewise with leaves. And the percentages reflect the actual examples within a population of just under 250 different genotypes, that we can find basically every example of those except for this one here. And this is just a number of examples of where we've seen that. So we're going to be looking at, from the architectural perspective, from the plant science perspective, of what we can learn, and in a number of cases trying to bring this together in terms of thinking about what can we do in terms of thinking about the future. And one of those examples is going to be in the range of urban and vertical farming. So it's thinking about the cultivation of, in effect, plant life within skyscraper greenhouses, or possibly on vertically inclined surfaces on buildings, and using natural light augmented by artificial light. Clearly, the advent of LEDs and also photovoltaics mean that the generation of electricity and very efficient use of those for lighting completely transforms the way that we can do this now. And of course, we're looking now at, within the building context, how humans can again coexist with crops, with agriculture, and obviously have that mixed use of actually living and agriculture within the built environment. Clearly, how do we balance the extra capital cost that may reflect and the running costs associated with it, but also against the benefits of reducing the importing from outside the city, and obviously the potential food security benefits of producing food within the city, and again minimising the potential disruption from the environment that may exist from conventional agriculture. So it's very much about thinking of building with agriculture and water treatment, and potentially we could think of this as, in effect, one building living. So when we think about things like vertical agriculture, there's been a lot of interest in recent years from a number of popular science, popular media, in terms of what this sort of thing may look like, and I guess the important bits is the thought process about how do we prepare for the future, and particularly thinking again to how do we prepare for a future where 6 billion people are going to be living in towns and cities. It's about thinking about how do we have more efficient and resilient crop production. How do we put less pressure on the valuable ecosystems that we want to conserve? How do we use this to reduce the carbon impact of human living and a bigger population? How can we in effect, create agricultural jobs within that built environment, and that important thing of food security within the cities? Very much that closed system, which includes energy production and recycled water within it. And I guess particularly in the case of Wales and the UK, how can we retrofit the existing infrastructure that we have when we may not be actually talking about new buildings from scratch? So really, I think now just at the end is, as a summary, what we're trying to do is create that new understanding, bringing together these quite different disciplines on how do we improve the efficiency of both buildings and crops. How do we get that balance right between urban lifestyles, crop productivity, and those broader ecosystem services. And I think something that's going to be really important in the coming sort of years and decades is about this need to connect urban and rural economies, the need for natural resources coming into cities, and the conservation of the of rural economies for that. And we see this kind of activity being important there. And clearly it's around climate change mitigation and adaptation. So it's going to get harder living in cities. We've been hearing about these big potential increases in temperatures, and therefore the ability of cities to be able to manage the things like urban heat island effects and so on are going to be really important. And so we think we've got the team together in terms of from these disciplines that's going to allow us to tackle what I think are going to be these very significant challenges. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.